The war in Ukraine has changed the world. And now we need to think about where this world is moving to, together. That's why MIM Business School is launching the nationwide educational project Reinforce UA, where the world's greatest minds will share their ideas and insights. And you will get their experience, change your perspective, and discover what changes should the business be ready for, before and after the victory. Every week on reinforceua.com.
Доброго дня, пані та панове. Мене звати Оксана Кукуруза, і від імені першої в Україні бізнес-школи МІМ я маю задоволення привітати вас на нашому проєкті Reinforce UA. Ми використовуємо англійську мову, тож для тих учасників, яким потрібен переклад, одразу рекомендуємо натиснути кнопку Interpretation. So let's start. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Oksana Kukuruza, and it is my pleasure on behalf of the International Management Institute MIM Kyiv to welcome you at Reinforce UA MIM Kyiv project, where prominent intellectuals share their knowledge with Ukrainians and strive to help us lay the foundation for a rebuilding of Ukraine after the victory. Thank you for your support. This project was made possible due to the support from Bogdan Gavrilishin Family Foundation, 50 Thinkers Organization, and 3 global associations of management education, namely AACSB, AMBA, and EFMD. We thank all our benefactors who have made donations while registered on our platform. Please be aware that any additional donations can be made at any time at the reinforceua.com webpage. We raised funds that will be allocated to support temporarily displaced Ukrainian women who want to launch their businesses. And before I give the floor to our honorable guest today, I would like to remind you that you can ask questions using Q&A button rather than chat. Please use Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Today's session will be recorded and will become available soon at Reinforce UA. Without further ado, I give floor to Michalskii, the founder of the projects aimed at helping humans to make better decisions together using the latest technologies. He is also an expert on trust. His experience acquired on the front lines of the tech revolution is critical in bringing together human brain capabilities and latest technologies. So today's lecture is Collective Sensemaking for Futures that Makes Sense. The floor is yours, Mr. Michalskii.
Oksana, thank you very, very much. I really appreciate it. And I'm very honored to have this opportunity to speak to you and to speak to Ukraine as best I can. I'm going to share my screen and go to a presentation to start and dive right in. So first, let me say I am going to pretend that this is the only time I get to talk to you, that this is our one and only chance to sit down across a table, across a Zoom screen and speak. I need to remind myself to speak a little more slowly because we have simultaneous translation into Ukrainian. So I will try to do that. When I get excited, I speak a little quickly. I am an amateur. I am not a political scientist. I'm sort of an economist. That's really what my undergraduate degree is in, but that was econometrics a very long time ago. I'm an outsider to Ukraine. I'm just an observer who is very interested and cares a lot about the situation. I'm not completely an outsider because my maternal grandfather was actually born in Chernivtsi. I've never been there. In fact, before the pandemic hit, my wife and I had bought tickets to go to Poland and Ukraine to do some roots work for me, and the pandemic did mess that up. I used to be a technology trends analyst, so I come out of the geek world, but I've developed a broad point of view about trust and memory that I will give you some feeling for because my suggestions, my advice come from that background. There is a hot war on. It's really ugly right now. Power is out across a lot of Ukraine because of attacks. And there's a very hard reality there that we can't and should not ignore. And we are making assumptions for victory in that war, which I see as imminent in some sense. Ukraine has proven that there is a great deal of resilience and pride and fortitude in the country and in people. And around the world, everybody has, I think, tremendous respect for what you all have achieved. So I'm taking as my mission for the next few minutes, what would I recommend to rebuild Ukraine, but to rebuild it better? Because so many parts of the country have been destroyed. The country has been front and center on the world stage. How can we make it better than before? And from the title of my talk, I said something about sense-making, and I'm going to explain sense-making as best I can, but imagine it as a way of helping one another make smarter decisions, and that the tools we have for that and the methods we have for that today are not great. So I will head in that direction. And then I'm saying collective sense-making, which is I individually might be able to make more sense of the world, but what if we could do that together? And how would that work for us? This is the spirit in which I am presenting whatever I say today, this idea of bringing back Ukraine better than it was before. For any non-Ukrainians, I recommend to you, you sit down and read the lyrics to Ukraine's national anthem, which is based on a poem back when by Pablo Chubinsky, and which appears to be written for this moment. It's a little bit male heavy about brothers, but it's just so moving for this particular moment. If we step outside of Ukraine for a moment, everybody is facing a series of really tough questions. For example, capitalism is apparently broken in many ways. Can it be tamed? Must it be replaced? If it's going to be replaced, by what? We've discovered, sort of the hard way, that profit maximization and shareholder primacy are destructive concepts. They're not really that productive. They're not regenerative for society. So we're wrestling with what should the economic system be like? Democracy is under siege worldwide. There's a question, was 2006 peak democracy? Was it as democratic as the world is going to get? And now we're sliding into what is called illiberal democracy or authoritarianism or despotism. But illiberal democracy is when a country appears to have democratic institutions like elections and journalism, a press corps and courts, except none of them are actually functioning properly. They are all owned by whoever is in power. One of the things I say about this mess is that the social contract is being renegotiated involuntarily worldwide. Around the world, all these movements, from the Arab Spring to the Gilets jaunes in France, Occupy Wall Street and Me Too, and a series of other things in the US, school strikes for climate change coming out of Sweden and spreading across the world, Extinction Rebellion, to try to raise awareness and get us to change our behaviors around climate change, and the rise of the global far right. These are all caused, I think, this is just my amateur opinion, by people who think that their children's futures are really bleak, that the future looks worse than the present, and they're willing to get up and protest. They're willing to break things in order to create some sort of new system. And this is chaotic and dangerous. This causes a lot of energy to show up in the world that feels dangerous, but could lead to some productive changes as well. So in the middle of all that, we have some players who are busy undermining facts and truth. So can truth be rescued, or are we in the process of losing consensus reality? Technology is also helping undermine truth. We now have technology that can make it look like somebody said something they never said, with a credible fake video and credible audio with just a little sample of their voice. Is social media going to save us or destroy us? And the question is really open right now. In many ways, social media connects us in beautiful ways that create a superconducting medium for information to travel. And then a lot of that information is mistaken or intentionally misleading. Artificial intelligence has grown extremely powerful. My background in technology goes back to being a neural networks analyst in 1990. And we are now 3 or 4 or 5 generations further along technologically. And these systems are capable of replacing work. These systems are capable of incredible things that don't equate yet and may never equate to general intelligence, to replacing humans entirely, but piece by piece are doing a very good job of that. How do we heal the tremendous cultural divides? If we go around the world, we see that elections are being split very narrowly, that people are really angry and mistrustful of one another. How can we heal those divides worldwide? Are wars just inevitable? Who expected at this moment there would be a conventional shooting war in Ukraine, and yet there is a really nasty one. And then as we're distracted by all these things that were sort of optional and separate, is human created climate change going to shatter us? Are we distracted from actually coordinating our activities together by all these different tough questions, when in fact we should be pooling our information and figuring out how to solve for climate change? Young people are very justifiably angry, and I don't see. It just makes a lot of sense that if you were born into this world and you were being handed this world by the older generation, you might think that they have messed up pretty badly. And for young people, I think if they could put some energy in and see some progress, they would have a feeling of purpose. And that would probably release a lot of that anger and turn it into productive use. The problem is right now, they're not seeing any progress. They're not seeing a lot of work and effort that in ways that's going to solve for their future. So I'm hopeful that young people will connect up more and more, and with their literacies, with their connectivity, we'll be able to make some progress that we haven't seen so far. So if you're a young person and you're trying to figure out what your future looks like, what visions of the future are actually on offer today? And this is my own scan of the world, and different people, different intellectuals and political parties and others who are saying, well, there's a group of people called the New Optimists, people like Steven Pinker, who are like, hey, go look at the statistics. Mortality is better, education is better, poverty is better. Things are just getting better. Don't worry. It's not as bad as you think it is. And I look around and I say, yeah, some stats are looking a little better, and then so many other things are looking pretty desperate. And we seem to be on some very important cusps, some very important tipping points that we don't want to tip over. And we're not doing anything because we're busy tipping society over in those directions. If we do nothing, if we preserve the status quo, seems to me we're already seeing escalating natural disasters of many different kinds. We're also seeing a general movement toward illiberal democracies, as I just described them, around the world. And this combination is pretty toxic for humanity in the long run, because we will be unable to do things together to solve for the disasters. There are many different groups of what I might call techno-utopians, people who think, hey, technology will fix this. One group believes in the fourth industrial revolution, that there's a series of technologies out there which, harnessed properly, will solve for this. And I come out of this technology world, and I'm afraid I'm going to report to you that the fourth industrial revolution is really just a bag of shiny objects. It's not a strategy or a useful framework as far as I can tell. The Internet of Things, robocars, deep learning, cryptocurrencies, and the blockchain, CRISPR and life science technologies, 3D printing. These things are components of solutions, but many of them are two-edged blades. They cut bad, they can be as dangerous as they can be helpful. And applied in the wrong way, big data, for example, turns into the surveillance state very, very quickly. So does the Internet of Things. And we don't have a lot of mechanisms in place to keep us from creating that surveillance state. So if I go back here to the fourth industrial revolution, another vision of the future is Mark Zuckerberg, the head of Facebook, now Meta, his metaverse vision. And when he announced it and changed the name of the company to Meta, I and many other people were scratching our heads because the demos that he was showing would have been sort of embarrassing around the year 2000. Anybody who was in Second Life or some of the early Avatar kind of worlds already saw things like what he was demonstrating. And to me, a world where we're all wearing goggles separates us further from each other. It creates physiological problems because these heads-up displays disorient us in really interesting ways that are not that good for people, especially not for prolonged use. And then those are just the physiological aspects, but really in this metaverse, then you'll be able to buy the scarf that avatar walking by is wearing. What's the use of that? Seriously, there's all the problems that I just described a moment ago. And I don't care what that avatar is wearing to make more commerce for Zuckerberg and the company's advertising in his medium. So I don't find the metaverse vision very promising either. Just across the hall or across the street are crypto humans who've had a bit of a humbling couple months here, but they're saying that don't worry, nation states don't matter that much, nor do companies. We're going to decentralize everything into distributed open ledgers, which is a vision I actually really like. Except then we're going to do this using a technology called blockchain. We're going to have decentralized autonomous organizations that are based on smart contracts. We're going to be able to trade non-fungible tokens and a series of other things that get obscure and complex, and in many ways try to replace human interactions with trustless systems, which means systems you can trust even if everybody might be a bad actor. And you'll see as I go further that that is an attitude that I'm sort of on the opposite side of. And I don't see that this is a very compelling kind of future either. So sorry for the missed techno-utopians. And then Doug Rushkoff just wrote a book about how billionaires are busy building shelters, and you'll note that Elon Musk has SpaceX, and Jeff Bezos and Branson. All these people are busy building space missions because it seems that they believe that we've already messed up the rock that we're living on, the Earth. So we must get off this rock and populate outer space, other planets, other things. And my punchline here is I've read enough good science fiction to know that you don't want to be on the first 1,000 spacecraft that leave this planet to try to colonize other planets, in particular, if we don't solve for trust. Trust is really important underneath all of this. So I don't know, do any of these sound appealing to you? They really don't sound appealing to me. I'm not excited, really, by any of these visions. And this is my list. I might have missed something. Send me email if you've got others that you think about. And I'm going to propose my own vision in a moment. But if I were young and I were stepping into this world, given the history and the messes that are on the plate right now, and these futures on offer, I'd be a little mad. And I'd be trying to figure out what to do that's more productive. So my offer, simple and naive as it may sound, involves trust and sense-making. And I need to explain it a little bit. So let me start with an equation I came up with a while ago, which is that scarcity equals abundance minus trust. So for example, one easy way to illustrate this is in the compulsory education system. So you put your child into a normal school, and the first thing that we ask is, how old is your child? And you say, oh, my child is 8 years old. So that's great. She's going to go into the 3rd grade. And so we place her into a room with 20 to 40 other people selected at random, with a teacher selected at random, it seems, with no ability to move around for other teachers, within an age cohort, a little band of months around which her classmates all were born. And what is abundance in the one-room schoolhouse that predominated 150 years earlier, where Susie taught Bobby his numbers, and he was, 4 years younger than her, and she was a couple steps ahead in her maths. That was a great way for her to learn and for him to learn. We've created scarcity, which is, gosh, now only the teacher is teaching, right? Where there was abundance before. And part of what we removed from this equation is the trust that Susie might be okay to teach Bobby his numbers. We took out the trust in what was a formerly abundant setting where lots of people could teach. The cashier at Starbucks, if it's not too busy, could teach your child some math. There's all sorts of things in the world, all kinds of people who don't have PhDs in education who could be teaching. That's an abundance. And yet we create scarcity at every turn. And so if you start to apply this lens of abundance, you start to also see that systems that are naturally abundant aren't just naturally occurrent. They require trust in order to thrive. And here, Lynn Ostrom, the economist, actually a political scientist, was discovering, she won the Nobel Prize for economics, despite not being an economist, for studying trust models for governing commons and creating abundance where you might think there would have to be scarcity, because there's this famous trope of the tragedy of the commons, which is for people like me, it's a completely failed meme or trope that humans have internalized. And we think, oh, commons are impossible because people always take advantage of them. It turns out commons are very possible, and commons are very likely the thing we need in order to create a thriving future. So, other things you can do to build trust include transparency. If there is corruption, if there's dishonesty, there's a whole series of things that need to be done for transparency. Famously, Estonia, when it won its independence from the former Soviet Union, sort of had to start from scratch. They really had to start from scratch. And so they created a paperless government where documents are easily found. They created a broad kinds of transparency. There are other countries with other sorts of laws that create transparency. The ability to see what's happening builds trust. Another big piece of what needs to happen is we need to deal very honestly with trauma and mental health, in particular in Ukraine, which is suffering so heavily right now, that hiding trauma and not talking about it, sort of sweeping it under the rug, is not at all helpful. And taking really useful approaches toward mental health will really increase trust across the country and across the world. And then finally, in there's many other trust levers, but one of my favorites is just assume good intent. Anybody who's used open source software probably has heard assume good faith or assume good intent as a byword of open source process. That in the open source community, and last week I was at a conference all week around people who do open source and corporations and others, all involved in trying to to improve the world of open source software. And this idea that you don't assume everybody is a bad actor, as in a trustless blockchain kind of environment. You assume good intent without being naive. But in general, on average, people are more trustworthy than we think they are. And we've sort of been convinced that they're not. We've been talked into a deep sense of fear of the other, fear of everybody. But it turns out most people just want to help. They want to figure out what their role is in society, in a group, in the family, in life, so that they can make their way through and create what we call a career. So there's lots of ways of tipping trust. Let me switch for a moment over to sense-making, which is a little bit complicated, but I think you'll understand it. And here I'm going to switch over and show you, this is a screen capture of my brain. And one of the quirky things about me is that I have the world's oldest mind map. And this is the actual brain over here, same place. So this, what I showed you a moment ago, was a screenshot of this place, this location in my brain. And each node in the brain is called a thought. This thought is called ways we snipped long-term relationships in finance, paving the way for the global financial crisis. So here is causes of the global financial crisis. And then here is the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008. This W here means it's a Wikipedia page. If I click on this W, it will launch my browser over to the Wikipedia page for the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And so anywhere you see an icon, that means that there's an article, a video. Here's an article from New York Magazine. Here's an article from the New York Review of Books. I am an American, so my media tends to be pretty Western, although I try to read other places. But if I go back to ways we snipped long-term relationships, this is my effort to make sense of the subprime mortgage crisis and the global financial crisis back then. And my thesis is something I call SNP, so ways we snipped long-term relationships. For example, we snipped bankers and investors' responsibility for long-term outcomes. So mortgage originators just became transaction mills. So they ignored risks. All they cared about was selling more properties. And that means it used to be that a bank interviewed somebody who wanted to borrow money to buy a house, and then they gave them a mortgage and held that mortgage for years and years, made adaptations if the person was in financial trouble and so forth. That world is gone mostly. So what happens is somebody sells a house, a mortgage originator immediately sells the loan off, and then that loan is diced up into these speculative instruments. So I won't spend any more time here, but I'm using this tool here to try to tell stories about how our world works and where all these things might go. So let me go back to my presentation. And the brain is one quirky tool that I've been using for 25 years. I happened to be on this company's first press tour 25 years ago. And so I've been using this tool for 25 years, the same data file. So the file I just showed you is the file that I started filling in 25 years ago. In fact, it's November 2022 right now. Next month is actually 25 years, the actual quarter century mark. So I need to have a little party, a little celebration. But filling out this memory for 25 years has taught me many things, including the value of having a memory, because I can find articles. On LinkedIn, a friend yesterday mentioned an article about Trump's early campaign in 2013, 2014. And then neither of us could remember the article. He then found it overnight and this morning said, "Oh, I found it. Here it is." I went and looked it up in my brain, and there it was. In 2014, I had put the article in under Trump's early campaigning. So there's a difference between drowning in the information torrent and personal sense making. And then collaborative sense making is a little more complicated. I happen to like this quirky little brain tool. A few other people do, but it's really quirky and scares a lot of people off. But there are a bunch of other sense making tools out there. So imagine collaborative sense making, which is too many syllables, as a kind of a multiplayer memory that lives above Wikipedia and the web and all the resources we see every day. And that this memory allows me to express what I believe and share it with other sorts of people. So this memory holds individual opinions, like what I just showed you, but allows us to approach one another with different applications, different bits of software. So one might be an outliner with backlinks. There's a product called Rome Research, which is very popular. Another person might be doing a process called Zettelkasten, which is slip boxes. It's a way of note-taking and encoding information that works really well. How do we come together to make sense of the world with different sorts of tools? And that's a really interesting project. And how do we do this so that we know who we're talking to and that our data is reliable and trustworthy? Those are large issues that need to be solved. But all of this to encourage comparisons and experiments with this data and with these stories that we're going to tell each other. And the goal here is to say, hey, I think we should do X policy decision. And then somebody else would say, no, we should do Y. And then if we had this medium where we can do collaborative sense making, then we could approach each other and untangle the reasons why we think these things are important to do, and then set up experiments or invite experts in to talk about the different sub-questions and sub-issues. So if we had a persistent environment where these conversations could happen, we'd be, in my own opinion, less stupid as a civilization. Right now, we are dumber than we normally would be because we've been treated as consumers, not as citizens, for 50 years. And when you're treated as a consumer, you're just the dumb endpoint at the end of a long food chain, basically the advertising chain and the supply chain. If you're a citizen, people hold you to different standards. You have a sense of interdependence, agency, responsibility. All those things have been taken away by the consumerist worldview that has come in and kind of eaten our brains, I'm afraid. And then if this multiplayer memory works properly, it should improve education, journalism, science, governance, policymaking, and more. So imagine that some policy question, for eliminating homelessness, and I'm afraid in the United States we have a really bad and shameful homeless problem. And there's a kind of policy called housing first, which says, instead of trying to push people off the streets and off encampments, offer them a place to live without trying to fix all their problems, without trying to get them unaddicted to drugs or whatever it is they're doing. Because having a shelter and being able to sort of eat and sleep someplace safe suddenly boosts people out of desperate straits. So if we had experiments about that, and there's many cities around the world that are actually physically experimenting with these sorts of things, including direct cash payments. There's a series of other interesting social policy questions where data is being collected. And imagine that journalists wanting to write about this could access the actual data sets that researchers, social scientists, and others doing this work were building and using. Imagine students who wanted to learn about these issues had direct access to data sets without corrupting the data. They could copy it off and analyze it. And imagine policymakers were in conversation in that space so that we could see together what the results of our actions and decisions are. Now, we don't really do that in politics. Not many places in the world do that, but I think that's a vision that I think we can possibly head for. So since the start of lockdown, I've created a project called Open Global Mind, which is just a community of practice. If you go to openglobalmind.com, there's instructions on how to join our conversations. And we're trying to figure out how to stand up something like what I'm describing here. So Ukraine and the MIM Business School could become a school and a laboratory for all these interesting new policy ideas, like the regenerative economy, donut economics, Kate Rayworth's thesis, the notion of commoning. David Bollier and Silke Helfrich are experts on commoning. Hybrid work, what happens as we come back from lockdown, and how do we manage remote work and in-person meetings and all of that? Should we be creating portfolio careers instead of single track careers? How might we rethink decision-making at a societal scale, as Germany experimented with in liquid democracy years ago? How do you create more workplace democracy, trusting your workers to get work done? How do we flip the legal system from retributory justice to restorative justice? Could we open up the worlds of science and research in different ways? And this is just my beginning list. But if you had a collaborative sense-making environment, a place to have these conversations, you could then imagine beginning to create this web of knowledge of things that we understand. And instead of knowledge being trapped in books and PDF files, I'm one of those people who says that PDFs and books are where information goes to die. Instead of that, we might actually build resources with which we could solve the kinds of problems that we're sitting and facing. So what has Ukraine learned from all the experience it's gone through? I think one of the things I want to suggest here, and I'll go through a couple of different suggestions, is ways of seeing differently. And one thing Ukraine learned, for example, was in 2014, when Russia came in and attacked the Donbass and took large chunks of Ukrainian territory, from my understanding, the Ukrainian army went and changed itself dramatically and shifted from being a very Soviet-style top-down army to being a very nimble army that has proven itself on the battlefield over and over again since February. So that's a different way of seeing as well. But also, we need to figure out how to reinvent ourselves and how to reinvent the future. So I'll give you a little example. Back in 2013, I gave a speech as part of Tony Hsieh's Downtown project in Las Vegas. And as I'm leaving Vegas, I thought, What if Las Vegas became the dispute resolution capital of the world? Now, why would I say that? So partly because if you think of The Hague, you think of the International Criminal Court. If you think of Brussels, you think of the EU. If you think of Geneva, you might actually think of peacemaking and negotiations. In Vegas, there's a saying, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. So there's a sense of confidentiality and a moratorium. Las Vegas is also sort of like Star Trek's holodeck. It can turn itself into anything. They have a pyramid, they have the Eiffel Tower, they can kind of, pretend to be just about anything. And then maybe most interestingly, Vegas is deeply familiar with pain and trauma. You only need to walk the streets of Las Vegas to see that. And every cab driver, every person you'd bump into could have empathy for other people's situations. And if you translated that into kind of a strategy, you could say Vegas might become the dispute resolution capital of the world. And that would be interesting, and maybe more interesting than trying to turn it into a family entertainment capital. And that's Las Vegas. And we all have a picture of what Vegas might be. So what has Ukraine learned, and what could Ukraine become? So let me add two things to this mix, two different ways of seeing. One I call the joy line, the other I call design from trust. This is the joy line. Imagine the line, and the easiest way to explain the joy line is in the world of insurance. And insurance says, hey, I'm paying you money for an incident I hope never happens. If it does happen, I'm pretty sure someone's going to find some fine print that says I'm not covered or whatever. And I might get a lesser car, or my car might not be repaired back to where it was. But when this system is working really, really well, it's just about making people whole, bringing them back up to this joy line. And there's this unspoken ceiling of our expectations. What if this weren't the ceiling? What if you understood that I have an expensive mountain bike that I haven't used for 3 years? And you could say, hey, Jerry, would you like to put your bike into the sharing economy? We know exactly what model you have. We have mocked up a little post you could put on some board online. And you could then just say yes, and we'll post it for you. And you could then get the experience of sharing out your bicycle with other people. Or maybe you should sell it, and we don't need to be making that premium income. Or maybe we can find a downhill bicycling club that is near you and make the introduction. All of these things are basically working above this joy line in new space. And if you think about insurance as really helping us use and appreciate our things better, as opposed to making us whole, that really shifts things. Let me layer on a different thought here as well, which is there's several words that I find compelling, but sort of lightly complicated. And here I have resilience and sustainability, which I think of both as being below the joy line. Now, Ukraine has demonstrated incredible resilience. And resilience and sustainability both seem to me to imply withstanding some kind of external shock and then coming back to where you were, kind of like this joy line concept. And there's two words that I like better, and I try to use them as much as I can, and they are thriving and flourishing. And they may sound a little too optimistic, but they open up mental space for not coming back to where you were before and building what you had before, but maybe changing it dramatically and creating a whole new world. So that's one set of ideas around the joy line, and then thriving and flourishing. Then separately, I've got this notion I call design from trust, because mistrust destroys abundance, as I said a little bit earlier. It turns out that trust is cheaper than control. Imagine for a second the costs of control, of locking things down, of policing them, of prosecuting violators and so forth. Imagine if some of those things can actually be done in social settings through social reinforcement. What's nicer is that trust actually builds community. My favorite example of what I'm saying here is a way of designing streets and intersections that is designed from trust, called traffic calming, or now shared spaces. And I was lucky, I interviewed Hans Monderman in Drachten in Holland back in 2006. He has since passed away, but he showed me how he was helping Dutch cities redesign their streets and intersections, removing the artifacts that we think add to safety, like traffic lights, taking them away and thoughtfully redesigning streets and intersections to actually make them safer. So accident rates would go down, but also people had a walking city again. So it rebuilt community. Before his interventions, a lot of these cities had a bunch of freight trucks waiting at stoplights, spewing diesel exhaust, and it was kind of a hostile environment for people. Even better, trust unlocks genius and creativity. So when you apply design from trust, you get a lot of benefits out the other end. So unfortunately, today's systems reject trust-based solutions. We are so well conditioned. We have so normalized mistrust. We take it so much for granted that when we hit a system that's designed from trust, first we think, gosh, this is impossible. What idiot is going to remove a stoplight and think that that's going to be safer? And it turns out that it is. What idiot is going to create an encyclopedia that allows anybody from anywhere in the world to come in and change information in the encyclopedia? And it's called Wikipedia, and it works. In fact, I heard a funny saying long ago, Wikipedia is one of those things that doesn't work in theory, it just works in practice. So today's systems, we've normalized mistrust, excuse me, so much that we reject trust-based solutions. And worse, there's people out there intentionally undermining trusts who have figured out that if we weaponize trust and we undermine our trust in each other, in institutions like journalism and the courts and elections, and if we demonize the other with a capital O, you can win power and win elections. And I think that's a realistic way of seeing the world today. So an interesting question over a couple bottles of wine is, how did we lose faith in humans? What happened to us? But really, there's a lot more positive things to do. And my question going forward here is, what if we trusted you? What if we could actually trust you? So I want to ask, how might Ukraine rebuild trust everywhere? How might Ukraine pioneer the next social and economic models? If the social contract is broken and people are searching wildly for the next one, and if capitalism is under siege and we're trying to figure out what replaces it, is it donut economics? Is it regenerative economics? Not sure. Aren't those great experiments? And couldn't Ukraine be a laboratory for those experiments? How might Ukraine, which is sort of being drawn toward Europe, build a better Europe? Europe is having its own problems. And, being a newbie into the EU might mean low status because you're the last person in, but in fact, or the last country in, but in fact, it might be an opportunity to break open these conversations and change them for a better Europe. And I would say Ukraine has an opportunity to build a better verse, a better metaverse with trust and collective sense making, that we can actually use these tools together to make sense of the world together, to move forward. And instead of buying the scarf that's on the next avatar, we could actually solve problems and make our neighborhoods and our countries and our continents and our oceans and our air much better together. And I think if I were young, that would sound exciting. And if I could be entrained into using my life energy for that, I'd be pretty thrilled. So I'm hoping we can move that way. I hope what I've shared here is interesting and useful to you. And I've created a page at the end of this presentation. I will pass a link, but there's more information where you can find some of the things, including this deck, which I will post openly alongside the video when it publishes. But I just want to say thank you very much. And I will stop screen sharing and see what questions you have. There's a question in the Q&A in Cyrillic, and I can't read it. Yes. So I will wait until Oksana has led me.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting, and really the intersection of technology and social sciences and political sciences. The question is, how can we Ukrainians trust the global institutions like the UN or anything global institution when they can't stop the bloody conflict, which was launched by one person and in many ways shaped by the one person? And how these well, I wouldn't even say obsolete, but very inhuman ideology like racism and fascism can be here in the 21st century of digitalization and technology? Thank you.
Wow. That's a beautiful question. And I struggle with that in modern times also with Donald Trump here in the United States. There's one person who ate the system and ran the table until it appears maybe last week when we had important midterm elections here, when Trump's candidates seemed to not work and things really started to malfunction for him. So that's another instance where there's one person who couldn't be corralled, controlled, where people in his party thought, oh, it's okay if he wins the election because we can control him. That turned out to not be very true. And so I think there's a monster question here, and that question that you just read asks maybe two different levels of question. One is, how do we trust the institutions, and the other one is the individuals. And I'm really interested in why these people can propagate lies. Part of the problem, for example, is that Putin is making assertions that bear no grounding in reality. Zelensky has been making a video every day for the duration of this conflict since February. There is no way, if you watched any one of those videos, that you could think that this fellow is a Nazi who's somehow trying to take over the world and attack Russia. If you just listened to him, faithfully and said, what is he saying and what do I think? I don't see how you could arrive at any conclusion anywhere near that. And yet, if you look at polls and you look at the pressure being placed on media and the ownership of media across Russia, that is apparently what a lot of people believe. So I think a lot of this actually is about rebuilding those little tendrils of relationships that need to exist and need to thrive. And some of it is being done. It's the phone calls being made to family, back in Russia by Ukrainians saying, hey, here's our reality on the ground. And I know that you don't want to hear this, but, and it's the rebuilding of relationships given the realities of the world and acknowledging those people's realities. In the United States, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we managed to lower all the barriers for corporations to move businesses overseas. And they did so, and a whole bunch of factories closed across the middle of this country and left people unemployed with no resources, and nobody showed up to help. But I'm exaggerating a bit, but really we just abandoned these people and said, good luck to you. This is just what capitalism does, and we're so sorry, and bye-bye. And that caused a whole lot of people to be extremely justifiably angry and to take, lots of measures. So how do we go to these places where people are mad and try to have courage and patience and rebuild these sorts of relationships? One of my heroes is a jazz musician named Daryl Davis, who has a garage full of Ku Klux Klan robes. He is a Black jazz pianist. And one day, 30 years ago, he was playing honky-tonk music in a bar, and a white guy comes up, leans on the piano, and they start talking. And it turns out this white guy is a Grand Dragon in the KKK. And through great courage and patience, 2 years later, they invite each other to their homes for dinner, and this fellow retires out and hands Daryl his robes. And Daryl now has about 200 robes. That work is fabulous work, because he is melting the hatred, melting the anger. And Daryl Davis's statement is, how can you hate me if you don't even know me? Sorry for the long answer, but there's just so many interesting issues intertwined here, including sort of geopolitics. And shall I just read the next questions in the chat?
Well, the next question is, what do you think about rebuilding a trust inside our culture, which main task is to find a spy in your neighborhood? How possible? And maybe some ways to start this process.
Yeah, thank you. So I've met several friends who grew up in the former East Germany, and famously in the DDR, 1 in 10 citizens was a Stasi informant. And from the outside, we would think of that state as a very, very low trust state because, hey, it's all spies, right? It turns out that in the black market, undercovers, in the gray market, how people actually got healthcare and education and helped each other was extremely high trust, because it was so dangerous. If you got discovered, that was a very bad thing. So in prosperous countries, or in countries that appear to be prosperous, there tends to be a superficial kind of trust that isn't necessarily trust. There's community that is pseudo-community. One of my favorite authors, Scott Peck, talks about this in his book, The Different Drum. And he says that sometimes it takes a trial by fire to start to build trust. So in some very, very weird way, the brutal pressure that Ukraine is under right now is a way to build that kind of trust. And then we're in a surveillance society. The state, if you're in China and running WhatsApp, WeChat, chances are what you are typing in is being surveilled. And if you sort of say the wrong thing, you might not be, with your neighbors next week. That's really dangerous. And so we need to understand how the platforms play a role, how media plays a role, and all of that. But I think there's lots of openings here to do better.
Thank you so much. It's very interesting issue and very true observation. There is another question. So which lessons based on trust case received from Ukrainian people the last time? Which are the lessons which the world received from Ukraine during the last time? So you as an outsider probably have another view, and what you outsiders learned from this conflict, from the war, let's call the spade a spade.
Yeah, thank you. It's certainly not a special operation. So years ago, I watched a documentary by Adam Curtis called Hypernormalization. And Adam Curtis works for the BBC. His specialty is going through BBC archives and discovering footage. And he has a strong point of view, which he then articulates by playing a lot of archival footage. And in Hypernormalization, he convinced me that we were already then in a non-linear war, an information war full of misinformation. And in this documentary, he profiles Vladimir Surkov, who was Putin's lieutenant of disinformation and a master of the art. And so when things started moving toward a shooting war here, I had a lot of respect for Russia's disinformation capacities, because they had clearly done a lot of damage in US elections and so forth. And I was shocked, absolutely shocked, at Russia's inability to fight a regular war, and incredibly impressed and thrilled at Ukraine's ability to defend itself and strike back. And so Ukraine has demonstrated a kind of courage, resilience, steadfastness, and national pride. I mean, when I learned the lyrics to the Ukrainian national anthem, now pretty much every time I see people singing it, I start to cry. I think the world has learned a lesson that just traipsing in and trying to take over somebody's country, violating sovereign borders, is a terrible thing to do. And this is the piece we need to figure out how to do properly. We'll suffer consequences. I hope a very large bill is presented that Putin and his cronies must pay. And already some of their properties overseas are being confiscated, et cetera, et cetera. But how do we do that more systematically so that these kinds of bad actions can be stopped? I was very, very negatively impressed that within a couple months, cities in Ukraine could be turned into Grozny, just by putting some grad launchers outside of town and sending missiles in and destroying all of the habitations in a town. That's just horrifying. And these are war crimes, right? So when there's evidently war crimes in progress, how do you put a faster end to that? And I think that's the question the world is struggling with right now, is like, what do you do to actually interdict, to stop that from happening?
Thank you. We'll hope we'll find answers. So, and the question is, would you comment, please, on the NATO reactions on the yesterday incident with missile in Poland, and with very cautious position, I would say.
Yeah, exactly. And I've read a couple pieces on it. I don't know that I'm fully informed on it. Clearly, if there was some kind of intentional targeting by Russia into Poland, that's a really big deal. And I think that Poland seems to have reacted very well on this. And I don't know where this is landing. I do know that very often what we end up thinking happened later is not actually what happened behind the scenes, that very, very often things are playing out really differently from what we imagined. If you had been sitting at the table or, seen the intelligence that other people see. So that's not always reliable. But the danger here is, of course, that this conflict escalates and suddenly involves all the NATO countries because they have Article 5 and a pact to come in and help. And I am no international diplomat, and there's plenty of decisions being made to try to prevent this conflict from tipping or escalating into a broad pan-European conflict. And I've just started watching All Quiet on the Western Front on Netflix. I'm a fan of military history and military strategy, and war is much more hideous than people realize. A brief note, during the American Civil War, a photographer named Matthew Brady was the first person who went to battlefields. He went to Antietam after the Battle of Antietam was over, and he took photographs. Now, you had to stay still for a while to take a photo, so there were no combat photographers then, but what he photographed was these bloated, dead bodies on the fields of Antietam, and those ran in newspapers across the country. And if you think about it, before that moment, people had seen hand-drawn pencil sketches or paintings of battles. They had this glorified idea of what war was. And suddenly they were faced directly with the horrors of the aftermath of war, never mind them, in the moment of battle. And that changed a lot of people's minds. So media has a really strong effect. And one of the things I was just pondering was in 2014, when Russia invaded the Donbass, why was there not a reaction like there was in February of this year? Why did Russia just waltz in and take a bunch of Ukraine's territory and everybody was just kind of looking at each other? Might have something to do with the availability of live drone feeds, and the media was different, or this attack is very different. I'm not exactly sure, but I'm quite sure that the world's response this time was sharply different and possibly really productive. That Putin's intentions to drive NATO apart and destroy NATO and others backfired entirely. And I think NATO and other alliances are actually being driven together more than before. And again, I'm an amateur and an outsider on these issues, but all of us care about these issues because we don't want this thing to just blow up.
Absolutely, I do agree with you, and thank you for your opinion, which is very informed, although may not be exactly professional. But as you mentioned in Wikipedia, in theory it is impossible, but it turns out that it works perfectly well. And you have another question. We have a couple of minutes to ask that. In your previous videos and speeches, you mentioned thriving and flourishing. And my question is, you mentioned that flourishing versus thriving, having an element of elegance and grace and style. Why do you think it is so important, this element of grace and style and elegance? Does it that it makes difference? Why this little something is so important?
A lovely question. You're sort of pointing to the aesthetics of life and our need to have a life that contains beauty and that contains grace and connections between people. And you could go through life functionally and build systems and do work and so forth and just go through the motions and not try to make anything better or more beautiful or build trust. And that's not a world I really want to live in. That's not an interesting world. I'm many years, my first job in the world was at Mobil Oil Corporation. Before it was ExxonMobil, I was a rate clerk looking up how much it costs to move packaged lubricating oils from a refinery to a warehouse, for example. A job that has been fully and successfully automated, I will say. And one day I'm in the bathroom and a young rising executive is in the bathroom before me. His name is Mike Hage. We don't exchange a word. All I notice is that he washes his hands and takes his paper towel and cleans off the counter and then throws away the paper. That is the only interaction, right? And I could observe from the way he treated his environment and whatever, that he very likely, as you do every little thing is how you do everything, that he very likely would be a responsible leader. And that was interesting to me. So for me, the care we take, the aesthetics we create and care about, and the care we express to each other, and the grace with which we accept each other's imperfections and whatever, are deeply important for how we rebuild trust, how we rebuild society, how we make things better. And if we ignore those sides of it, it's a lot less fun. It's a lot less beautiful. It's a lot less inspiring, right? You kind of want to be in that place where things are happening of beauty. So I love the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a second. So here is a comment and a question. When we talk about trust, it is built on the reciprocity of the parties. How would you rate the degree of trust between the US and China? And where is this border that can harm Ukraine, this thin line?
This thin line. The US-Chinese relations are extremely complex and historic and all those kinds of things. And again, I'm an amateur here, not a sinologist, although I subscribe to some people who care a lot and know a lot more than I do about China. And there's been the last multiple decades since China became more capitalist and became sort of the manufacturing engine of the world, have transformed relations between the two countries. And for a while, you had to go to Hong Kong to figure out how to do anything in China, and then you didn't. And then you just went directly to China and built factories and did whatever. And at this point, we have a global system that is deeply intertwined, whether we like it or not. And we saw during the pandemic, as transport as logistics were broken in different ways, just how vulnerable we were because of that. Then there are a bunch of strategic assets that get built in China. And gosh, this war with Russia has really raised that issue. And I think Americans are trying to figure out, well, how do we bring those? How do we onshore those again? How do we bring those back so that strategic assets are local? And that would affect the trust between the US and China for sure. And then the obvious, the gorilla in the room here also is Xi Jinping, who is apparently making himself sort of leader for life as much as we can see. And that's happening in many different countries. That's part, and China doesn't pretend to be a democracy, but it's part of this shift toward authoritarianism and illiberal democracy around the world. And you just have to worry about that. I did watch a Peter Zeihan video recently where he said that Germany and China, because of energy reasons, are very likely going to have a very hard time in the next decade or two, like an extremely hard time. And I don't know that I agree with everything he was saying. But sometimes variables we don't pay much attention to right now become really important a decade later. And it's hard to foresee sometimes which ones those are going to be, right? In the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey, Kubrick has this vision that we're going to be traveling to, space and so forth. And he has basically female stewardesses on these flights. He misses like the revolution in women's rights, in women working in like the shift of roles, just not a thing in his vision of 2001, right? Not present for him. And so sometimes we're blind to things that are kind of in front of us until they're so big that they've overwhelmed us and that the change has actually happened.
Thank you so much. And unfortunately, we have to finish with that. It was a pleasure having you, and thank you for a very inspiring presentation and discussion. And thank you, our attendees, for your questions and attention. So I hope that this recording will be very soon available to all our viewers, both in Ukraine and outside. You are welcome. We have both Ukrainian and English version of this episode. And please join us for the next episode in a week's time. It is going to happen on November 23rd at 6 p.m. as usual, and our speaker will be Christian Rengeng, one of the Europe's top strategy and innovation authorities, a keynote speaker, business school faculty member, and a workshop facilitator with a global clients. So he will talk about startups and scale-ups and will exactly what we will need in our nearest future. So thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Michalski. It was a pleasure having you, and see all of you in a week.
Thank you so much.
The war in Ukraine has changed the world, and now we need to think about where this world is moving to, together. That's why MIM Business School is launching the nationwide educational project Reinforce UA, where the world's greatest minds will share their ideas and insights. And you will get their experience, change your perspective, and discover what changes should the business be ready for, before and after the victory. Every week on reinforceua.com.